Thank you so much for being here this morning on this beautiful sunny Sunday morning in November. Joshua and I were just talking about how stunning it is, and usually, you never know, it might be a snowstorm. One edition, last year there was definitely snow. I should introduce myself. Many of you have already heard me interview people this edition of Kwayatonk. It's such an honor to be part of this festival. I'm Julia Caron. I host the morning show Quebec AM on CBC Radio, and it's such a delight to get to interview authors in front of a live audience because I'm so often stuck in my studio by myself speaking to someone by phone. So it's so great to be here in person with Joshua Whitehead. Joshua might not need any introduction, but I'm going to read your biography from Making Love with the Land. Joshua Whitehead is an Oji-nêhiyaw Two-Spirit Indigiqueer member of Peguis First Nation, Treaty 1. He is the author of the best-selling novel Jonny Appleseed, which was published in 2018, longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, shortlisted for the Governor-General's Literary Award, and winner of Canada Reads, and the poetry collection Full Metal Indigiqueer, which was the winner of the Governor-General's History Award for the Indigenous Arts and Stories Challenge in 2016. He's also the editor of Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction, and he recently completed a PhD in Indigenous Literatures and Cultures in the University of Calgary's English Department, Treaty 7, where he teaches and writes. Joshua Whitehead lives in Calgary, Alberta, but he's here with us in Quebec City. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. On a beautiful day, I'm very excited to explore your city. I did a little bit, but I always finish kind of like the work with the festival around like 4:30, so it's always dark. So I was down at the pier yesterday, so I'm very excited to see it in the daylight. I think it's going to be doubly as beautiful.
It's a really beautiful day to explore the city, and it's a beautiful day to talk about your work, your art, and the stories you share with us. I wanted to start by talking about some of what we've already got to experience this year as part of the Salon du Livre des Premières Nations. On Friday night, there was a really special evening put together by Shane. I want to remember everybody's names. I don't have the program in front of me, but I think Shane Michael, yes, with you, alongside Billy Ray Belcourt, of course, and Moira Wachetskum-Bacon, and Alexis Volant. And for people who weren't there, it was just a really special evening of sharing queer stories. What was that like for you?
It was a lot of fun. I took French for a handful of years, but we don't use a whole lot of French in Western Canada or in the prairies much. So it's a bit rusty, and by a bit, I mean very rusty. And so it was just very kinetic, I would say, and like I didn't really fully understand everything everyone was saying, even though I had the script, and if I read slow enough, I can. But there were some like hilarious moments with Moira. I don't think I've ever heard the word horny said so many times in a Quebecois accent, and I loved that. We also got to hear the translation of that into French, which was hilarious to me, that it translates to something like I'm in heat.
En chaleur. Yeah, it doesn't have the same ring to it as horny.
It's direct, it's honest, I respect it. And it kind of just brought me back to my, I guess, tutelage in Winnipeg, which was just like a lot of spoken word, a lot of collaboration. I worked with a lot of jazz musicians in Winnipeg, so like learning rhythm, learning how to like build a sentence like I would a chorus. So yeah, it just kind of brought me back to like the roots of just small, like barely published Joshua Whitehead in the downtown streets of Winnipeg. And I just think that's how I love hearing poetry like that. It is supposed to be collaborative. Writing is not a solitary exercise. It's not in a vacuum, as much as like Ernest Hemingway likes to think we just like, drink whiskey on the sea and write melancholic stuff. And yeah, it was just so much energy, so kinetic, so cerebral at the same time. But I love seeing the movement. And I'm sure if you saw me, I can't not move my hands. So it was musical, I would say.
It was a really special moment, and I have to say, I know some people in the audience have been a part of the festival since the early days. I'm looking at you, Maurizio Gatti, who is here all the way from Italy. But he was here for some of the very first editions, and I was reflecting on some of the things that have changed within the festival over that course of time, and I've been thinking, this is the gayest edition of the Salon du Livre des Premières Nations, I think, ever. And I see so many people smiling and nodding because it's amazing to get to see. And it's such an honor to have you, Billy Ray Belcourt, new voices, Moira Wachetskum-Bacon, who told this, for people who weren't there on Friday night, told this very tender story about Juliette gently cutting off the tag off of her Halloween costume, off of their Halloween costume, and just those little moments of early queer feelings and the physicality of it came up so much in all of the different texts, even though we had two-spirit speakers, people who identify as gay, people who identify as Indigiqueer. What was it like to be part of that diversity of stories, both linguistically, but also in terms of sexual identity and gender identity?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a type of, how do I say this? I mean, yes, it is diverse, and yes, we come from different Indigenous nations with different languages and worldviews, or the fancy word epistemologies, and we're speaking about different experiences across this place that we call Canada. When you're in a room with queer Indigenous people in whatever identity categories that they intersect or identify with, it's like a homecoming almost. Like, it feels so comfortable. It feels very welcoming. It's incredibly safe, but it's energizing. It's like hopeful. It's futuristic. And that's why I always kind of say that, like, queer Indigenous people as individuals, when we are collected, we have this vibration that like echoes and calls for one another. And when we are together, it's like a type of kindling that like bursts into this wildfire. And it's unfortunate that it's such a rarity. Like, for example, Billy Ray Belcourt, a great friend of mine, but we really only see each other on the road. And so, yeah, when we do come together, it's just an inferno in the best connotations of that word. So a beautiful rarity. I wish we as like our communities had that more often, but I never ever take it for granted, and I always just leave like that much more full, I would say.
That makes me want to read just a little bit from Making Love with the Land, where you write, you're on the road, recently, can I ask you to read it? Or would you rather hear me read it? Yeah, just where it says recently on a trip home.
Okay, through to, yeah, okay. Okay, so this
is on the fly, by the way. I usually check beforehand, so thank you, Joshua, for abiding.
Oh, this was the one. Okay, you were asking about this the other day. So this comes from an essay entitled "The Year in Video Gaming," which was during the lockdown periods of COVID, as most of this book was written in. Recently, on a trip home from Saskatoon's Anshkok Indigenous Literary Festival, I reveled in the glory of Indian joy with Indigenous women and queer Indigenous folk. Flying back to Calgary, I sat with my dear kin Billy Ray Belcourt, and we haughtily, unabashedly, and noisily discussed the politics and the livelihoods of surviving and living as queer Indigenous Napewak, or men, amongst an audience of mostly non-Indigenous men, one of whom, seated behind us, then leaned in to listen. We talked about sex and sexualities, partners, desire, joy. It was marvelous and truly one of the most medicinal conversations I've ever been privileged to have. We asked, and this is also what Fire Emblem, which is a Nintendo video game series, that's a role-playing game, asked of me, am I queer enough to be queer? While my embodiment as that video game's character, Byleth, or my online handle Zoa, who's also the protagonist of Full Metal, while my embodiment as Byleth Zoa wooing the napping genius Linhart in the game was part of me thinking about relationality, I was also pondering futurities and boundaries, both of which are bound up and hyperbolized by anxiety, which can be read as an incessant fear about or distrust in the existence of a visible future. I wanted the monogamy, the solitude, and the static of a moment unencumbered by either past or future, a moment beneath a tree, wholeheartedly embraced by the plethora of relations blossoming into being around us in a land sovereign to its own found families. A queer utopia, perhaps, if we think of the biosphere as a cavalcade of families made from native and invasive species living in relative harmony, and not only for a singular moment.
One of the most medicinal conversations. I loved reading that, and I feel like you can see, for people who were at the Morin Center yesterday, you're signing books next to Billy Ray. You get to spend time together in this context. I also want to ask about, you mentioned Zoa, the main character of Full Metal Indigiqueer, and I read you joke somewhere that Zoa would totally have a crush on Jared from Eden Robinson's Trickster trilogy. So even among the characters in your books, there's this intersection and exchange with Eden, who's been writing books for such a long time. Tell us more about that playfulness of Zoa would totally have a crush on Jared.
I think both of my characters, Zoa and Jonny specifically too, from Jonny Appleseed, would totally love Jared. You know, he is a wayward kid, but he's resilient in how he makes things come to fruition. So I feel like we could have $5. Jared and Jonny would have $5. Go to Walmart, like buy stovetop stuffing, the box for like $1, some craft dinner, and have like the most beautiful feast. And then they would have the most raunchy,
messy
raucous,
is the word that comes to mind for me.
Evening. Yeah, so it was funny because I did tell Eden that I was hosting her in Calgary, and I was like, I just need you to know, like, my character, who I refer to in the third person, he's very animate to me, Jonny. It was like, would love Jared. And then we had a conversation about, like, two-spirit characters in her literatures. And so something she's like, I'll take into consideration. And then we had beautiful queer characters in her subsequent novels to the trilogy.
Yeah, I love, for people who were there yesterday with Eden Robinson, I love how open she is about how others influence her writing and who push her, because so many people cite her as an influence. It's nice to know that she has this relationship where there's a sharing of stories, and there's a non-binary character in the Son of a Trickster series. And it's something that's becoming more common in Indigenous literature. I'm also thinking of some of the characters in Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. And these are books that have a very wide audience too. So it's really exciting to see. I also wanted to ask you, Joshua, about the art of that you feature in your books on the cover. Making Love with the Land has this beautiful piece by Winnie Trong. You've also featured Kent Monkman's, you write about The Chase by Kent Monkman, which is the painting that's the cover of Full Metal Indigiqueer. When you're looking for, you spend so much time carefully choosing your words and really crafting the text. What's it like to make that next step where you're like, okay, this is going to be in people's hands, this is a book. How do you want the cover to reflect certain themes that come out in the book? With Winnie Trong, I just think it's absolutely stunning because it literally is a figure that looks like it's enmeshed with nature and land. How do you go about that process of saying, yes, that's the art I want on the cover of my book?
Yeah, I think that the whole creation of a material object, such as a novel or a memoir or a book of poetry, the agency that the writer has we don't have like the full control of everything, right? We have editors, we have publicists, we have book designers, we have people selecting fonts, layout, structure, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very collaborative. At least I take it as such. Maybe some authors just like let people do the full graphic design. But I'm like really interested in like the aesthetics of a novel. I know everyone says don't judge a book by its cover, but we do. There are some books that have choice covers that I'm like, and they have been amazing books.
I love that gentle way. Choice covers. Choices you wouldn't make for your own books.
Is doing nothing for you, right? And so with Making Love with the Land, we had a handful of original covers, which I just released for the 2-year anniversary of it with the publication of the soft cover on my Instagram. And so you can check that out if you want to. But they featured like this little tiny figure who was like always in this cloak, and there would be like large.
True. Yeah, there were like 3 or 4 propositions that had that general theme.
There were, yeah. I didn't
Very
understand.
Very tiny figure, ambiguous figure. Like
ambiguous, yeah. And like large sweeping landscapes. Some were like dunes, and I was like, I don't understand why there's sand. There's no sand. Well, there is sand, but not in this book, in Alberta and in this book, or in Manitoba. And it just kind of reminded me of like Ghibli, like, Ghibli films, like Howl's Moving Castle, very Miyazaki. And like the aesthetic kind of for me read like either like a graphic novel or like young adult fiction, which was not the kind of signals I wanted to give with at least looking at the book. And then there were others, one that felt very tropical and had like a tiger, and I was like, this, again, why? We're in the prairies in this book. And so I had a lot of conversations with with the design team, and they were very receptive, and we just kind of shot ideas. These quotes from the book, like kind of like what I see as the visual, they pulled some. And then it was actually Jason Purcell, and they used to run Glass Bookshop in Edmonton, which was a beautiful independent bookstore, which is now Magpie Books. And they had recommended the work of Winnie Trong. Because I put a call on my social media. I was like, please help me. Because one, as an author, you should not also have full control. Like we're so tunnel visioned and attached that it's like the book is right here in front of your face and you can't see anything else. Like that's what an editor makes, like they are also a huge collaborator to books, translators as well for my other ones. And so I was like, I should not have unbridled access to every single thing. So I put the call out. Jason Purcell had suggested Winnie Trong, who's an Albertan artist, does this beautiful 3D collage work. So if you're ever in Alberta, or I think she's also touring with her most recent exhibit.
Yeah. Winnie Trong, it's absolutely, check it out.
Do see, Truong. And then we saw this image and I was like, that's it. I saw it, I fell in love with it. Like there's a woman who's like entangled in the earth and vines, and then the cover design team like entangled it with the words on the page as well. And I was like, chef's kiss. It's beautiful.
It's absolutely stunning. And you mentioned this came out around the 2-year anniversary of the book first being published. This edition that I have is the soft cover edition, but it also has a discussion guide written by Geneviève François, and it touches on some of the elements you touched on yesterday in your discussion with Shane Michael and Billy Ray Belcourt about sometimes some of the first questions that some audiences have are a bit 101, a bit, they're asking a lot of Indigenous writers to explain, like, well, why is this? So I just wanted to read to give people a sense of the discussion guide. I'm just going to read one paragraph, which is under the header of How to Be a Good Guest to Making Love with the Land, which I love that choice of the word guest instead of reader. To begin this guide, we must consider what it means to be a good guest to a work of writing, especially one that deals with the political and personal as intertwined. We are all living within a world built on the project of colonialism, whether we are on Turtle Island or not. We must recognize that colonialism is not limited to history, that it is still present and active in shaping Indigenous and settler lives. We must also recognize the important contributions of Indigenous peoples to the land, especially on Turtle Island, and we must strive to understand Indigenous peoples not as a monolith, but as multiple peoples with different cultures, histories, philosophies, and ways of being. It goes on. I highly recommend it, especially for anyone who's an educator or a teacher. But I'm curious to know more about what that discussion was like, what the discussion was like to have the discussion guide. What was that process like with Geneviève François, with Knopf Canada? Or this is Vintage. The imprint, Vintage Canada edition from Penguin Random House.
Yeah, the discussion guide was a lot of fun. Again, it was a full team, but it was mainly led, as you noted. And to synthesize a whole book into like key talking points was a difficult endeavor. Adaptation is hard. Like I'm working also on the TV adaptation of Jonny, and I was like, I just need to be like on the sidelines. Like I cannot be in the screenwriter's room because I'll be like, that's not how this happened. And I as the writer, would just keep shutting things down because I just have this like quote unquote like purity vision of this. So I'm just on the sidelines. And the same thing with the educator's guide as well. I was like, I will just be like a consultant mostly, and allow you, who's also an academic, to have the full reins of this. And so it was important because I think a lot of folks thought, well, there's an essay in it, Writing as a Rupture, which is, I suppose, you might think academic or theoretical, but I really kind of think about genre and form and how Indigenous literatures abide by those, but also are outlaw to it. And so, yeah, the speaker's guide was a great way to address maybe some very initial modes of thought or knowledges that a reader should have while going into this, right? Or how I could use this to teach in the classroom, be it in public school, probably high school, or mostly in academia and university, post-secondary. And so it was just a lot of fun to do. It's a lot of fun to see. And I was very inspired by, with the publisher and then with the team writing it, by Desmond Cole's work and having the educator's guide in it.
Yes, if people aren't familiar with Desmond Cole's writing, he's based in Toronto, and I'm totally blanking on the beautiful book of essays, the title of his book, The Skin We're In. I believe there's a copy of it in English at this library if you're interested. But one of the stories, personally, as a journalist, I really appreciated that book as challenging this idea of objectivity, weaving in one story that kind of encapsulates some of the deep-seated injustices we have ingrained in Canadian institutions a lot of the time, and just how hard he's had to work as a Black journalist, working in Canada and working in Toronto, in one of Canada's most diverse cities. So it was inspired by some of what he does in that book, where he's really making some of these ideas accessible to people who may not have access to post-secondary education, who may just be new to some of these subjects. I love that. It doesn't surprise me that there's a link there with that. And it's exciting to see those kinds of texts emerge in Canada today. You also wear your references on your sleeve. If anyone has read Making Love with the Land, the amount of songs you reference, I was like making note, and I was listening to Brandi Carlile, which I'd listened to the album when it came out in 2018, but I hadn't listened to it again since. And so then you gave me a wonderful excuse to play Brandi Carlile on the radio across all of Quebec on Friday morning. So thank you. Thank you for that. I want to know more about what you love about, you're obviously a music fan, but what is it you love about interweaving sometimes segments of lyrics, sometimes just giving us a sense of what's on in the background while you're writing? Why do you want to include your musical references and influences in your writing?
I love this question. I rarely get asked about the music in these books. So I guess there's two reasons. I'm a very intertextual writer, meaning like being inspired by Desmond Cole, right? Speaking to Eden, both in person, but also like literature itself is conversational and is communal in that sense. So at least for my work, I love to pay homage and to give credit where credit is due, and to pay due diligence to the writers who have come before me, who have come beside me, who are coming after me, because I come from along, like, this book, me being here in this space, would not have been possible if it not for the work, the decades-long work of Eden Robinson, right? It would not have been possible for not the decades' work of Thompson Highway and Gregory Schofield. It would not have been possible without Daniel Heath Justice and Beth Brandt, and even prior to that, it wouldn't have been possible without Maria Campbell, writing Half-Breed. And prior to that, it would not have been possible with the likes of Pauline Johnson, Doug Nwage, and then prior to that, our ancestors who are storytellers too, right? So this is not just, I'm not here, and this book didn't just appear serendipitously. It is a part of a long continuum, really, right? And so, yeah, I always need to acknowledge that me being in a space with these books, memoir, fiction, poetry, etc., is not just mere coincidence, right? People lived, worked, died, and fought for presence like this. And so I love to speak to their works because they do inspire me. How could I not be inspired, right? And the second thing is just like, I also hate silence. Silence really hurts my ears. So the fact that I hear like children playing right now is like bringing me joy.
Thank you to the children who are playing in the staircase over there.
Thank you. If you had interviewed any of my partners, they would probably tell you that like Joshua Whitehead sleeps with 2 fans on, even in winter, if it's freezing cold. So they always say, like, it sounds like I'm sleeping in like an airplane hangar. There's so much wind and noise. I just can't sleep in silence, and I can't work in silence. So I always have ambient music on. I walked up today with AirPods on. And so when I'm writing or reading, I need some kind of music, and I need a kind of soundtrack to be the undercurrent to what I'm working on. So with Full Metal, which is this really cacophonous, or there's a lot of things going on all at once, it's really hard to placate yourself and place yourself. It was a lot of electronic music, house, rave that I had to listen to. With Jonny, it was a lot of pop music. So you got like, your Dua Lipas, your Charlie XCX. If Pink Pony Club was out, he would have loved that, but it was not out when I was writing.
Yes, we love a Chapel Roan shout out.
She would have been there.
She would have been there. If she had been releasing music then, she would have been there.
It was like your Gaga, your Madonna. And then I was in Banff, finishing at the Writer Center there, which we folks talked about a little bit yesterday. And Eden was talking about very vivid dreams, which is true. Like the Blackfoot and the Nsittepi people, like they say we're not supposed to be sleeping there because it's a space, ceremonial space. It is heightened. It's like the membrane, I would say, between this physical material world and spiritual spaces is really thin. And so I always have wild dreams. If you've read Jonny, I'm sure you know what dreams I'm referring to. There's a bear dream. There's an apocalypse dream. And so I had to listen to, when I was finishing Jonny, a lot of like round dance music, which was what helped me round, I guess pun, fully finish this novel. And then with Making Love with the Land, it was written during the lockdown periods of COVID. I was living alone. I had just been broken up with by a long-term partner a couple of months prior. This was not planned. And just completely isolated. And, we couldn't be around anyone. I think there was this beautiful moment in the lockdown periods when people started to understand that even though we are alone physically and touch-starved, intimacy-starved, love-starved, what we did to heal from that, or feel held, was so many people were back walking in natural spaces, visiting rivers, being on the land. And I think for a small glimpse, every single person, Indigenous not, understood the relationship that they had with the natural lands around them. And I hope and I wish that everyone takes that and still remembers that, that feeling of being held on a hill, or how the wind caressed you. For me, I was always at the river. And for us in Cree and Anishinaabe forms of knowledge, these things are animate. The river is a living being. The land is, the wind is, for me the mountains were. And so even though I was so physically starved in terms of touch, I was also held polyamorously by these non-human relations, right? But I was also so nostalgic for home. I wanted to go home. We couldn't cross the borders provincially. Right. I did eventually sneak across the borders by going through the US. Got back to Manitoba. But for me, country music, specifically female country artists, Kitty Wells, Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, right? And then for me, I love Brandi Carlile. I spread the gospel of her everywhere. I had to listen to this continually. My grandmother's house, we would cook dinner or make tea in Bannock, right? And she would have NCI, which is the country station on the reservation in Peguis, playing in her kitchen. And so there would always be these like oldies country songs. And to me, that just like brings me right home. And so I needed that.
Patsy Cline, too, you named. Just immediate
Walking After
nostalgia.
Midnight, I mean, come on, that's a classic.
Some of the best songs about loneliness are sung by Patsy Cline.
They are. And they may be so lonely and they may seem like almost like sadomasochism to be like endorsing your own sadness, but it does, I always feel like so communal because it takes me right back to my great-grandmother's kitchen and my grandma's kitchen. And so I needed all of that to write Making Love with the Land.
You're making me think of the line when Walking After Midnight, when Patsy Cline sings, I stopped to see a weeping willow crying on its pillow, and the connection to the land and nature, even if it's an old country song from a different era. Audiences have reacted to your musical references. You shared with me that I initially thought that maybe you had made this playlist, but no, readers have made playlists of the songs that are referenced, and there are many, the songs that are referenced in Making Love with the Land on Spotify, on Apple Music, on other platforms. What was it like for you to see that somebody had taken all of your musical references and put them together in one tiny place for you?
I was like, give them the Nobel. They deserve all the awards. But, I mean, I was joking with you, and I'll tell you folks the story. With my editor, with Knopf, and my agent, Cody Caetano, who's the author of Half Bads and White Regalia, beautiful Anishinaabe Portuguese book, /person/writer, that I was like, if you do not reel me in like 5 years, the next thing will become a musical. And so, I don't want to write a musical. I'm not a singer-songwriter. I could do karaoke, but that's about it. But yeah, I loved seeing it. And like these are like, they're always on my playlist regardless, but I love, letting other queer folks see that rurality or being in rural spaces is not a death sentence, and that like there is space for you in country. Like Brandy Carlisle herself is a queer country artist, right? And the Highwomen. And so, yeah, it just brought me so much joy, and I hope people are getting to listen to these too.
I suspect I know the answer to this question already. You mentioned you were wearing earbuds earlier and listening to music. Do you own a record player by chance?
I do. I have a really bad habit for collecting things. So I have, once I get started on something, I collect. So my library at home is way too large for my house. I had to move everything to my university office and request more bookshelves, which are 6 full, and I had to donate 8 boxes of books because I've never gotten rid of a book since 2016 until this year.
Wow.
So I had so many. I have a large collection.
I don't doubt it based on, I was digging through my own bookshelf while reading Making Love with the Land. In one of the first essays you mentioned, Ocean Vuong, on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And then there was a little reference to Cormac McCarthy's The Road, so I had to dig that one up too. And I must admit, it's a pleasurable experience as a reader, be like, oh yeah, I remember that from that book, and then to go dig through it. But the reason I was asking about the record player, I got distracted. The reason I was asking about the record player was I was going to take a page from Eden Robinson's book and offer you a gift.
Oh.
I have a copy of The Highwaywomen, the Highwomen, their record, and I was wondering if I could give that to you.
I would love this.
So I just felt like you offered so many gifts in your writing that I had to share this with you. This is, Brandy Carlisle is one of the members in the Highwomen, and you referenced their song Cocktails and... Cocktail and Song. For people who don't know their music, can you just give us a sense of what you love about Cocktail with the song?
So the Highwomen obviously is a play on the Highwaymen, and so it has Brandy Carlisle.
That's why I accidentally called them the Highwaywomen. No, it's the Highwomen.
The Highwomen. And so there's a lot of beautiful songs that feature 4 artists, Brandy Carlisle being one of them, Maren Morris is another. But Cocktail and a Song is probably my favorite song from this record. It's mostly just Brandy singing. And so Okay, I lied. There's two favorite songs. But Cocktail in a Song is a morning song where the singer, sung by Brandi Carlile, is with her father. And he basically is on his deathbed and he's telling her, like, don't mourn me, be joyful. Let's just have one more cocktail and sing one more song. And I cannot listen. I'm like getting emotional.
Just thinking about the song makes me want to cry.
Yeah, and so it was a song that really held me when my uncle was dying. And I was also stuck in Alberta in the lockdown, and so I would listen to the song on repeat, and like weep and weep and weep, because it like made a little space for me to mourn and to be in grief. And so, yeah, I love Brandi Carlile for always, like, I said in the acknowledgements, for like always meeting my grief in a honky tonk.
Yes, and also I should also mention, I make a point of doing this all the time. Anytime I interview an author, I look at the acknowledgements. But in this case, it's really, you wrote the acknowledgements. It's not a list. It's not a laundry list. It is very much.
It's like poetry.
It's like poetry. It just begins. You asked me, what is your biggest fear? Like, that's the start of the acknowledgement section of the book. So that just tells you, like, you're in for, if you haven't read this collection of essays yet, obviously I highly recommend it. So that's just a beautiful element. I wanted to make sure, there's one question I had for you, Joshua, that I've overheard people talking about it at this year's edition in a way that's been really lovely to hear. And it's about the language of queer identities under, you use the term Indigiqueer. There's also the term Two-Spirit. And one thing I learned through your writing is that Two-Spirit is actually a very recent term. It's from 1990, and that's not when the idea of Two-Spirit comes from, but that's when the term was coined. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of Two-Spirit and how you came to use that term, but also Indigiqueer, which are separate ideas?
Of course, you're correct. The term in English was coined in 1990 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is my homelands, in Treaty 1 by Anishinaabe elder Myra Laramie, Laramee, who is also from Fisher River, which is a reservation minutes away from mine. And so it was like made at this third intertribal conference, basically, for LGBT Indigenous folks wanting to find a term that was sovereign, knowing we already had terminology, but that it was so targeted by settler colonization and the enforcement of gender binaries and sexual binaries and sex binaries, etc. And so enforced through Christianity and Catholicism. And so, yeah, this term was used. I think about it just as a placeholder until that we, as Two-Spirit or queer, trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming Indigenous peoples, relocate our terminology, which we are doing, and we are following in the wakes of elders and aunties and uncles, and working with them. So I think about it just as a placeholder. Like, I don't think language ever dies, it's just foregone, or it's never forgotten, it's foregone. So like I think that'll be my lifelong work. And Indigiqueer is a very new term as well. It's a portmanteau of Indigenous and queer, obviously, but it differentiates queer Indigenous peoples from the LGBTQ spectrum, which we kind of call as like settler sexualities, because it's so invested in capitalism and in colonization and in whiteness. And so this was also a way, so there's these two terms, I use both. Two-Spirits sometimes is critiqued by Indigenous folks who think about, as it does sometimes enforce these things as well, as we like undo the work in our own communities with our own people to understand that. And so this one is also kind of a placeholder, but a lot of the youth use it. And it's also a hashtag, I guess, if we still kind of use that term, that connects so many of us, right?
Yeah, I was thinking of that in terms of, in some spaces like TikTok, for example. Indigiqueer is something that you'll see there that you wouldn't see, I was going to say 10 years ago, but TikTok didn't exist 10 years ago in the same way. Vine, yes, Vine, the precursor to TikTok. I think we're almost exactly the same age, Joshua. I feel like a lot of our internet references and musical references overlap. It's almost time to wrap up, and I think I wanted I had brought this book with me, Daddy Lessons by Stacey Easton, because this was another book I came across recently that wrote about music in a way that I really love. There's a part about PJ Harvey and PJ Harvey's gender in it that's so good. But also the fact that, I'll just read just a line from the back cover. Daddy Lessons is a cocky and tender reclamation of childhood and teenage wanting. As a fellow prairie queer, I felt exposed and liberated by Easton's pornography in unexpected and titillating ways. And that's a quote from Vivek Shraya, the author of I'm Afraid of Men, performer, singer, songwriter, amazing person. When I was reading this, I was just like, I kept thinking, I grew up in small town Ontario. I grew up on military bases. I grew up around a lot of homophobia and a lot of violence. And to read voices like yours and voices like Stacey Easton coming out and reshaping those ideas, I guess my question to you is more, you're always forward thinking, you're thinking about the future. What's it like to realize that you're part of a chorus of voices from Western Canada who are challenging ideas we might have about what it's like to live in Alberta, in Manitoba, and have maybe a flattened idea of what that reality is like. And now we're seeing many voices share their varied stories.
Yeah, I am very bound to the prairies. So when I finished my PhD, I'm trying to be humble, but places where we want you to come work for us, right? Like UBC, Ontario, Toronto, UT wanted me, the East Coast wanted me too, and then a couple spaces in the US. And they were all amazing offers, but I didn't want to leave the prairies because I'm so attached to it. It would make no sense for me to be in an oceanic space, right? Because I have no connection to that. My people, my stories, everything about me doesn't come from there. And so I stayed in the prairies. I stayed in Alberta, which is very much run by the UCP, or the Conservative Party. Major cuts to funding and healthcare and gender affirming care and trans rights and decolonization and indigeneity under this Conservative Party in Alberta by Danielle Smith. But I felt it was important that I stay because I do think there's this narrative for queer people to do queer flight, which often means going to queer utopias like Toronto, like Vancouver, or San Francisco, or New York City, and being in these large urban denizens or spaces, right, that are more accepting, and I completely understand why. But for me, it's an important politic and it's an important practice that I can show that in rural spaces, in the prairies, that there is and there always was and there always will be queerness. And so it's important for me to be in those spaces as much as they may target me politically or personally or in any other factor, because that's my homeland. It would be a disservice for me to leave. And so I think I will always very much be bound to the prairies, be queer in the prairies, be femme in the prairies, and be unabashed, because in the homeland, yeah.
Joshua Whitehead, thank you so much for your writing and for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for this. Listen to the Highwomen, especially
Listen
Brandy.
to Brandy Carlisle.